Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time it is for you in the world. It is Friday the 13th, and I can tell you that there is something to that because my guest and I have had wild connection problems today in the technical sense, not in the personal sense. And so we are here with you on Friday the 13th, and I invited this particular guest, Mace Perlman, because it is Friday the 13th, as I will explain. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio, as you know, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. And my guest today is someone who we've traveled in the same orbit, but we've never alighted at the same place at the same time. But we have discovered through distance that we have a huge amount of important things in common. And very specifically, the man Giorgio Strehler. Giorgio Strehler, the great theater artist, director, opera director, who tomorrow, August 14th, 2021, would have turned 100 years old. So in addition to talking to Mace Perlman about Mace Perlman, I want today's conversation to also be a document by two people who knew Giorgio Strehler in, I think, very different ways, to try to explain the prism that was that magnificent and difficult man who, depending what light was cast on him, reflected back in different ways. And I think that that was part of his genius. But friends around the world, please meet Mace Perlman, a classically trained mime. He studied in Paris under Marcel Marceau from 1982 to 1984. He studied with Strehler in Milan from 1987 to 1993, so a good, long, powerful period in Strehler's life. I was with him in the 70s. You acted in the very famous classic production Arlecchino Servitore di Due Padroni, Harlequin, Servant of Two Masters, by Goldoni. Mace has translated, directed, acted in works by Shakespeare, Marivaux, Molière, Goldoni, Chekhov, all the big guys, Dostoevsky. And you are working to create an Academy of Renaissance Theater, about which we'll talk. And we will also talk a lot about circus, which is one of my many passions. It's way up there. So Mace Perlman, welcome. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So I actually have a question of you first. Where
yes.
I am in New York City, it is insufferably hot today, and you are wearing, you're stylish, a jacket, a scarf. Where are you?
I look like a madman, don't I? I think yesterday and today have been the absolute hottest days of the year, insufferably hot and humid, but I'm in a kind of basement apartment where the air conditioning is blasting on high, and I thought, sure, I'll put on a scarf. Actually, this scarf makes for, I love this color because it was handmade in Indonesia and dyed with saffron. And I know you are a great lover of cuisine as well as theater. And since we're talking about Milano, and the great dish of Milano is the risotto milanese, I thought what better scarf to wear than a saffron dyed natural scarf. This also happens to be the color in the coat of arms of William Shakespeare, a kind of mustard yellow. And I found myself wearing this scarf a lot when I was working in Stratford at Shakespeare's home and playing in his garden. So anyway, it's a scarf that has a lot of spiritual meaning for me. And
well, to me, that color is the house curtain of the Metropolitan Opera, which
there we go.
Historically is made of silk and was made in Como and near Como, north of Milan, which is one of the great, probably the great silk industry in Europe.
Yes.
And one of the top in the world. And here's a tip: when anybody visits Milan, get on the train to Como. It's a wonderful city for many reasons, but also because the quality of the silk and the prices are so good that it's perfect. by the way, one thing about Como that a lot of people don't know, during World War II, when La Scala was bombed and the company seemed to have shut down, they actually did not shut down. They moved to Como and they performed in the Teatro Sociale. So the company never stopped working. They just sort of went a bit undercover, but they kept their musical and theatrical chops going all through the war. So Mace, I'm
Fred,
going to,
I love
yeah,
that story. I have never heard that story. And by the way, you say this color reminds you of the curtain at the Met. You mean the curtain of the old Met,
the
the
house
original
curtain. No,
Met.
also the new Met.
Okay,
New Met, except we don't see it very often now because they create show curtains for each almost every opera production. But if you go to a couple of the old Zeffirellis, such as La Boheme and Turandot, you will
right?
see that house curtain.
Love it.
Yeah. So, what I want our listeners to know right away is a couple of things. You are, quote, from the theater, and I, quote, am from opera, but the two are very connected. They're first cousins. And we go in and out from one to the other, and Streller certainly did that. I began my young life as a child actor, but frankly, I got a little bored repeating the same things, and I wanted to do things that were always new.
Mm-hmm.
And while I have great respect for the principles of acting, and I've used them um, in direction of opera, I think that Streller, for me, and we'll get to him, understood that in me about being spontaneous in the moment in an opera sense. Now, I
Yes.
just have to reveal one thing to you, and you can attack me if you wish. It's the following. When I was a kid, I was very fortunate in New York to be taken to all kinds of plays and Broadway musicals, and not just for kids, but adult stuff. Operas. When I was 3, I was already going to the opera, and I was a very good, attentive audience member, with one exception. I was taken to see Marcel Marceau at City Center, and I was so beyond bored and frustrated that I uncharacteristically made noise as an audience member and began to cry, which is something I almost never did. I so wanted out of there. And I have thought about it since, because he was a genius and he had a fantastic backstory in the resistance. And I'd love for you to talk about that. But I think the absence of sound for me was exasperating, because I guess I'm a very trained listener and became an early listener. Even in my cradle, I was apparently a listener more than a speaker. And so the requirement to observe things that did not necessarily make sense to me, like him climbing walls and all the genius things that I later came to respect and admire
Yes.
hugely. But why would some people, do you think, not respond to mine?
I'm fascinated. I love your story. I would never attack you, Fred. I can't imagine that. But I love the fact that we have these sort of sacred cows, right? You know, Marceau, the greatest mime of all time, you know, William Shakespeare, the greatest playwright of all. Well, nonetheless, right, nonetheless, we have our experiences, and experiences are extremely valuable. So I'm actually quite fascinated by what you're telling me. I think, and by the way, before Marceau came to America as an unknown, ended up on the Ed Sullivan Show as an unknown, and became a real kind of overnight sensation, and then became friends with a lot of the great silent comedians. You know, he became very close to Red Skelton, very close to Stan Laurel. He found an artistic home in the aged vaudevillians
Mm-hmm.
of early American television. Um, he knew many of these people and adored them. Well, before he came to America, Marceau loved to tell us this story. He said, as a French mime in the theater, he would receive catcalls and boos from the audience saying, turn up the volume, turn up, you know, people hated what he did. He suffered a great deal from that, came to America, became an overnight sensation and arrived back in France practically to a ticker tape parade. And he never forgave his compatriots for that. He said, I come from a nation of, let us say, hypocrites. I mean, he felt very hurt because suddenly he came back and the French said, oh, we knew he was a genius all along. And, as artists, this is a very interesting story, that we are always applauded. We somehow can never be great in our own hometown,
Mm-hmm.
we have to go elsewhere to be lauded so that we can come home and be recognized by our own circle. Anyway, I find that very interesting what you're telling me. And I'll tell you another just quick anecdote about Marceau. He was playing in the Greek theater at Berkeley, California, outdoors. And one thing, Marceau had many genius attributes, I will say. We could easily talk for an hour and a half about Marceau.
Well, let's speak about him too, sure.
But yes, and by the way, he and Giorgio Strehler share a common artistic ancestor, which was a man called Jacques Copeau.
Mm-hmm.
We may come back to him as well because he was a true genius of 20th century theater, not so well known in America as Stanislavski or Bertolt Brecht, but certainly should stand with those figures. Anyway, as a great visionary of the theater and a great master of acting technique. Anyway, where was I? Marceau was performing at the Berkeley Greek Theater, and he was on stage and in the middle of some piece, and he turned. It's funny, it's hard for me to tell these mime stories because I'm in a little Zoom box. I feel very, although yeah, exactly. I feel very limited in my, and to make matters worse, maybe I'll put my glasses on. I end up looking at myself, which is very boring. I'm not as good a narcissist as I should be as a performer, but I'm imagining all the millions of faces out there, or maybe 11 faces, to be fair, but
just
who
talk
knows?
To me.
Yes, I'll just talk to you. But what I wanted to say is that Marceau was on stage, turned to his side and saw another man standing right next to him on stage. And as Marceau told this story, he was a very good storyteller, by the way, a great raconteur, as they say, great storyteller. And he'd say, under his breath, he'd say, who are you? What are you doing there? And the man said, of course, the mime who whispers under his breath, what are you doing? This sort of stage whisper, what are you doing there? And the man turned to him and said, you called and I came.
Mm.
Now, here we are in the midst of a pandemic. It would be very easy to dismiss this as a case of mental illness. However, Marceau had a kind of absolutely charismatic, does not begin to explain. He had a presence, and I know you understand this from the world of opera. There are certain people that we like to call animals of the stage.
Mm-hmm.
And when they enter, all eyes are suddenly fixed on them. Marceau had this incredible kind of ability to project into a space, not only his physical presence, but his internal, shall we say, his internal state. In other words, like Hamlet likes to say, I have that that within, which passeth show. These are but the trappings and the suits of woe, of grief. He says to his mother, no, it's not my inky cloak. Don't pay attention to any of that. It's what's inside. Marceau was able, one of his favorite phrases was, mime is the art of rendering visible the invisible. And I think that's a very beautiful way of putting it, that we were able to see the workings of his mind and his emotions, his thoughts and feelings, all of that in the back row by some alchemy of the theater. And we can, not quite as mystical as that. He also taught techniques for doing that. And of course, with Giorgio Strehler, I played a lot in the masks of the Commedia dell'arte. And those masks are really tools. I like to say when I teach young actors in mask, that the half-face mask is a tool for amplifying the human soul. So when I look out into the audience wearing the mask, my inner life can reach the back row. And we will tie this in, I hope. I'm putting a lot on the plate here, but I think Mozart, of all operatic composers, and I know we put on the list a little Mozart for us. Strehler adored Mozart, revered Mozart, but I think more than any other composer, we know this to be true, in Mozart's great finales to his acts, you know, you can have up to, I think, 7 characters, all singing at once, And yet, rather than experiencing a kind of musical mud, we have this direct, almost laser focus into the inner life of each of those beings. And so the cinema tries to do this with a split screen. You know, it's never been very successful, where you get like a close-up onto all 7 characters at once. You can't really do it. I mean, in fact, with Zoom now, we have an interesting situation. But somehow the magic of the theater is that the audience member can receive a tapestry of individual consciousnesses all together in contrast with one another, and yet somehow creating this sort of glorious, harmonious whole, even while they are all in conflict. So anyway, to me, that's part of the art of the Commedia dell'arte.
And I'm going to stop you right there because I want to make a cup. You've laid a big table. It's not just a plate.
I've laid a big table here. I tend to do that. But,
that's okay. I do too.
But to back up with Marceau, just to say that you are not the only one who found himself missing sound. But I will say that what Marceau, it's very interesting. He often used music as a background to his silent acting. But we as students, he said, no, I don't want you to use music. You must first begin to taste the music of the soul. In other words, you must understand what is the melody and what is the rhythm of your inner state. What is the melody and rhythm of anger? What is the melody and rhythm of melancholy? What is the melody? So now we're approaching, in a way, the mime has to sort of compose opera in silence, if that makes sense.
Okay, so sometimes these conversations like tennis, this is more like the shot put.
Yes, marathon.
The marathon. You raised a lot of good points. I just want to reply to a few of them. One of them is Mozart, who I adore, was not alone in putting 7 people on the stage and having each one of them be clear in their conflict. Rossini did it with 7. And my friend Giuseppe Verdi outdid them all. He did it with 14 characters in Falstaff and the fugue at the end of Falstaff, which was his conclusion to life, basically. And tutto il mondo è burla. Everything is ridiculous or silly or crazy.
And Fred, remind our listeners, he was 90, how old at the time, 93?
No, Verdi wrote Falstaff 1893, and he was born in 1813, so he was 80 plus.
This was the magnus opus of an
Right.
aged
He
artist.
was 80-ish. Well, Michelangelo, when he was 82, wrote down Ancora imparo. I'm still learning. So
Yes,
these
yes,
two men are two of my heroes. And Titian
yes,
was 86 and still painting. And Manuel Rosenthal, the conductor, was conducting at 98. So these
yes.
exist. Elliot Carter was composing past 100. George
So we have
Burns was,
something to look forward to.
thank God, George Burns was
Yeah.
telling jokes with perfect timing at 100. So
Yes.
a few things. Number one, you were talking about Marcel Marceau bonding with the vaudevillian in the old comics. Vaudeville in America was a sort of theatrical form that included variety, varietà, as the Italians would say, comedy and music, and you might have an opera singer come out and then chorus girls and a comedian and a clown. And George Burns, who I adored, he was applying for a job at the Palace Theater in something like 1914, and they said, we need a dog act. So George Burns puffed on a cigar and he said, so I went out, bought a pound of liver, got myself a dog. I had a dog act.
That's fabulous.
His
Yeah.
timing was all related to the puffing of the cigar. He was the best
Yes.
timing. But another thing you prompted my thoughts was, I never had an issue with silent movies. For example, somehow the moving characters, maybe the occasional title cards, maybe the music that was accompanying it all went together. But I didn't
May
have,
I
yeah,
may I interject that Marcel Marceau, by his own admission, would never have existed as an artist, creative artist, man of the theater, had it not been for Charlie Chaplin.
yeah,
So,
sure.
you know, Marcel Marceau had a North Star. It was his pole star, just as Woody Allen had the Marx Brothers, right?
And Ingmar Bergman.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
He had two
So,
polar stars.
yeah, Marcel Marceau's pole star was Charlie Chaplin. It was the reason he became what he became. So, but you enjoy Chaplin and had no problem
Oh,
with
yeah.
that.
And also Buster Keaton and all of them, Harold Lloyd, the whole
Okay.
gang. But even, the silent actors, John Gilbert, Greta Garbo, the Gish sisters, and so on, silent. I was fascinated. Abel Gance made a long film about Napoleon. It was magnificent, and there were no
Magnificent.
words.
Yeah.
So no words. I want to remind you, by the way, that one of the lesser known films of Mel Brooks is called Silent Movie.
Yes.
And it was a silent movie, and only one word was uttered. It was by Marcel Marceau.
And what was the word?
I don't remember.
You know what?
No, I
I
don't
may be
recall.
proven wrong, but my memory, if memory serves, at a certain point in the movie, they call up Marcel Marceau to see if he wants to be in the movie. He answers the phone. No. Puts the phone down again. That's the one word. No. Brilliant. Yeah.
But anyway, so there is that. But also, I think as we begin to tease out the ideas of Streller, it's important to know, number one, that he was born in Trieste.
Yes.
And Trieste was it was the chief port of the Austrian Empire, then Austrian-Hungarian Empire, from 1361, I believe, or 1381 to 1918. And he was born in 1921. So therefore, it basically was still completely Habsburg in flavor.
Yes.
He had parentage that was Swiss, that was French, that was Italian, that was Slavic, that was Austrian. He was trilingual in French, Italian, and German. Never spoke much English, by the way. I don't know if you ever dialogued with him in English. I did not.
I did not. That's a very interesting thing. His great regret was not to be able to read Shakespeare in the original, but I think he had an almost kind of, how shall I put it? It was almost at a cellular level, something about the American consumerist capitalist society, which so disgusted him. I mean,
Well, I'm going to stop you. We're going to
he
go to his
felt,
politics later, but I really want to stick to his childhood so our listeners have
yes,
a
but so
foundation.
he never learned English. No.
I know. Um, and his family was part of the Teatro Verdi, which was the opera house in Trieste. He had several key relatives die very young, and he moved with his mother to Milan when he was 7. But
Yes.
nonetheless, the cosmopolitanism of Trieste, which to
Yes.
me was and is still much more cosmopolitan than Milan, which is a
Yes.
wonderful city, and I've lived there for a long time, and very self-regarding, and they feel that they're great in a lot of ways, and they are. But it's about Milan, whereas Trieste is about the world, and you embrace differences. And in Trieste, there are houses of worship for Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, Jews, Greek Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, all there. They coexist. They eat to some degree each other's foods. Trieste brought James Joyce to Trieste, who lived
Yes.
there and wrote a lot of Ulysses and other works there when Streller was born around that time and just
Yes.
before.
And
And yeah,
most Americans, our American listeners may not know, but a very, very great Jewish writer of Trieste named Italo Svevo, who was a kind of Italian, I mean, very close to James Joyce.
Yep.
But Trieste was absolutely a kind of cultural crossroads. And I think we cannot emphasize enough. We started by speaking about silk, the Silk Road, Commedia dell'arte, which we will talk
Wait,
about.
I'm going to stop you because you're
Yes.
opening all kinds of doors, kind of like Bluebeard's Castle.
In a moment.
Let me open the doors. Okay.
Okay.
But the thing was about Trieste, I can say in my personal experience, he is the one who told me to go to Trieste.
Yes.
I had been to Friuli Venezia Giulia, the region of which it is the capital, for various reasons, one of them being the earthquake that they had in May of 1976. And I went to do relief work for a month, but that was in the Friulian part, in Venzone and Gemona and towns north of Udine. But I never got to Trieste. And it was Streller who said to me very specifically, you, Fred, you're a New Yorker. I don't know New York well, but you will understand Trieste and you'll understand me if you go to Trieste better.
Wow.
And so I began to spend a lot of time in Trieste, and fast forward a number of years, I wrote a book called La Terra Fortunata, which is about Trieste and the region of Friuli Venezia Giulia, because it became so close to my heart. So I thank Streller for, I would have gotten there anyway, but not in the context of understanding him, who was my master teacher in a way.
Yes.
And I think it's always very important, Mace, that when we look at people and not only their experiences and who their parentage was, I always say that he or she who was born in the place where they were meant to be are very fortunate. If they are not, if they understand where that place is and they get there early and allow it to form them, then they're almost as fortunate. And other people, unfortunately, never quite have that. And although, yes, he was basically Milanese and he spoke Milanese dialect, and I witnessed him coaching and directing the singer Milva in Milanese dialect.
Yes.
And so therefore he knew that stuff because he got to Milan when he was 7, but he never let go of that Triestine cosmopolitanism.
Yes.
That I think he carried with him wherever he went, because Trieste, having been under so many different empires and dominations all through the years, although being independent, some cities fall for that and other cities become more complex for that. And the complexity of Trieste, I think, is a big part of who he was. And there's also something in Trieste and in Venetian dialect, I'm not a good pronouncer of dialect, Ciarlar, Ciarlar, which is a certain kind of animated but directed chatter.
Yes.
That you enjoy the interaction of the chatter, and you hear this in Goldoni plays, which we'll get to.
Yes.
Among Venetian women, a certain kind of cadence to the speech.
Yes.
That they have in the Veneto and in Trieste, not so much. They do it actually in Friuli as well, but that had to be replicated for Milanese audiences when Goldoni was done there. So there's that. You also were talking about Copeau, right?
Yes.
And I think it's important to understand that both Marcel Marceau and Streller were men of the left politically. Yes. They had very strong social consciousness that they used their art to explore.
Yes.
And sometimes they did it with new works. Sometimes they did it, a lot of times they did it with classical works.
Yes.
In, quote, your world, it was more the theatrical form. In my world, it was more the operatic form. But the value system was the same. And Streller, I don't know so much about Marceau, but Streller often went to Switzerland as a refuge, in part because he was anti-fascist and spent the war in Switzerland and directed Caligula in Geneva, and became.
And I believe also T.S. Eliot's Murder in the
Cathedral.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And acted, and he was, what we call a man of the theater, as you are a man of the theater. You're not an actor or a director or a translator. You are a man of the theater. And he became he was a cosmopolitan European.
Yes.
And I think it's very important to emphasize that, because the world has received wisdom or notion about what the Italian style is. And you can call it Zeffirelli or Visconti. I don't think it's fair to say the Italian style, but I wouldn't call him the Italian style. I would call him Italian rationality and going to the essence. But it was not about decor. When there were scenery, and especially lighting, which he was glorious at, it was not to create an effect and not just to be beautiful.
No.
But it was to, I'm going to go where you went, to find ways to express the interior, the vita interiore, as the Italians say, of characters and situations. So I want to now ask you, how did you get to Streller? How did you get to Milan? Why did you stay 6 years? How did he keep you for 6 years? How did you survive? He was magnificent, but he wasn't easy. Is that fair to say?
Well, let me begin by saying, had I had the opportunity to work with him further, I never would have left. In other words, most of his actors, once they arrived at the Piccolo, they tended to stay there.
Explain what the Piccolo Teatro is.
Well, in England, it was called the Little Theater Movement. And after World War II, Giorgio Strehler, 1947, Italy is in ruins. Giorgio Strehler is 26 years old. And together with his school fellow, actually, they met at waiting for a tram. They met at the bus stop.
Do you know the tram stop?
You probably know the actual one. Which one?
Yeah, well,
no, hold on. Corso Buenos Aires.
Via Petrella, the tram number 6.
Oh, well, Fred, you've beaten me.
He took me to the spot.
Okay. So anyway, he and his partner in crime, Paolo Grassi, he was little more than a boy, really. He was 26 years old. And I just want to say, I am Jewish. My father and mother both Jewish. My father came from Bucharest in 1940 to the United States. I just want to take a moment to recognize, that both Marceau and Strehler were forged in the fire of resistance to fascism. So I continue at my age now. I'm almost 60. I'm, in my late 50s, but I think all of that is still so recent. It's still so recent. In any case, Giorgio Strehler and his companion Paolo Grassi chose to.
We should say professional companion.
Yes, professional.
Okay, right. Because companion nowadays means other things. They were not.
No. Right.
Yeah, right.
But they lived, ate, and slept theater together. You know, it was a life commitment. It was no 9 to 5. And the two of them took over this palazzo in the middle of Milano on Via Dante, called I believe it's called the Palazzo Visconti, actually. Is that possible? Anyway.
Not Broletto?
In Via Broletto, no, but I think it, anyway, it's
Yeah.
a 16th century, it goes back at least to the Renaissance, maybe a medieval palazzo. And let us remember that when they came to this abandoned villa, and they identified their stage space, there was light coming through the roof, like a spotlight, which sounds romantic, you know, that the stage was lit up at midday, but in fact, it's because the roof was leaking. But more significantly, where they were to eventually make the dressing rooms, they had to clean the blood from the walls because those had been used as torture chambers by the Nazis, the fascists.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think it's quite heroic and amazing that these two young men had a vision for the kind of theater they wanted to make, which was a socially engaged theater that was going to be part of, I almost am thinking now of the Greek polis, you know, that Strehler had an idea about art and how art could be in dialogue with the city. And that the theater was not, certainly never, as you say, his stage design was never merely decorative, although he had a deeply ingrained aesthetic sense and love of beauty. But he always felt that he was serving a higher purpose, which was the purpose of illuminating some aspect of human life for his fellow city dwellers, for the community. So the Piccolo Teatro di Milano, the Little Theater of Milan, was the very first regional repertory theater, modern repertory theater. And, you know, following Strehler, there were famous theaters in Genova, in Venezia, all over. But he was the first. So he was kind of, at age 26, he was truly a leader and a flag bearer for a new generation of artists. And let us also say, with a brief interlude where he left the theater in order to go out in the streets in 1968 with, you know, to join the youth of Italy and of Europe in protest. He was the artistic director of that theater for 50 years, 5 decades. So
for American listeners, I'm going to interrupt. For American listeners, I want to create a parallel, and even people from elsewhere who've been to New York. In New York City, we have something called the Public Theater. Yes. And it was founded by Joseph Papp around 1960. In the 1950s, they did free Shakespeare that traveled around in a little bus and truck around the city, and then the Delacorte Theater, famous Shakespeare in the Park, every summer. And even in the pandemic, we have the Very Wives of Windsor this summer. But the Public Theater was installed in a library on Astor Place that had been the Astor Library, and the city sold it to Joseph Papp for $1. Yes. And Papp was brilliant and irascible, and he combined always Shakespeare. He was really the first to have what we call colorblind casting, and include people of all shapes and sizes and gender and it was a mirror of New York City well before anyone else did that. And the Shakespeare was very multicultural in a great way. He was the one who introduced the musical Hair and a chorus line and Hamilton and many, many more. So they managed to produce hits, but also use those hits to finance very experimental things that maybe were not to everyone's taste, but that doesn't matter. And the public theater is a very vibrant theater. Even now, Joe Papp died years ago. There's a wonderful head now named Oscar Eustis, who I admire greatly.
Mhm.
And so New Yorkers and Americans would understand the Piccolo Teatro di Milano as being like the public theater. There were differences in that primarily Giorgio Strehler was such a figurehead of that theater and directed, whereas Joseph Papp did not direct very much, and Oscar Eustis does occasionally, but and beautifully. But I think that Strehler was the identity of the theater, which leads me to ask you, Paolo Grassi was brilliant, but he was not the public face.
No.
What do you think about their relationship as professional theater artists, that one could basically recede, whereas the other was this dynamic force that everyone, even if they knew nothing of theater and opera, could say Giorgio Strehler, Milano?
Well, I'm jealous of, to be honest, you know, I'm jealous of that relationship. I grew up, I never got to meet Paolo Grassi, sadly, because he passed, I believe, in
1981.
1980.
81, after
81.
heart surgery, yeah.
I never met him, but he was a dedicated, oh my goodness. They were a team, you know, they were such an important team. In other words, Strehler, the artist, could not exist without Paolo Grassi, the managing director, the promoter, you know, all of that. In other words, we all know the greatest theaters have always had a kind of marriage between the artistic direction and the management, you know, the financial and producing direction. And the two of them had such deep love and respect. Well, they knew each other since they were teenagers. So they were lifelong, that's why I said partner. I think it's hard to imagine in the American universe that kind of a partnership where each really allowed the other to soar. And there was never a jealousy. In other words, Paolo Grassi never wanted to be a director. Giorgio Strehler never wanted to look at the, you know, he didn't. That was not his thing. But the two of them, somehow, they shared values at such a deep level, a deep artistic, a deep spiritual level, that there was always a greater good that they were both serving. And, you know, many people would like to call Strehler a narcissist, whatever. You know, he had his detractors, but the man I knew was always, he was always at the service of something much greater. And you knew that. You felt that from the moment you met him, that he was serving in a very, you might call it idealistic way, but in a very practical way. He always believed that there was a work of art, whether it was Shakespeare's play or Mozart's opera or Verdi's opera. He was not the author, he was the interpreter. And his task was to illuminate a work which he had not created, but which it was his task to profoundly illuminate, you know, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, aesthetically, on all these different levels. And he managed to do that on all those levels. So again, you ask me, why would I stay with him? We felt that he was profoundly engaged on so many levels with the work at hand that it was only natural to be head over heels in love with him. You know, he was all too human. You know, he could have a bad temper, sure.
Oh, yeah.
He was not saintly in any way. He was very human. with his failings as well, but he engaged us in a task which was superhuman at times. And so there's no question that most of the actors I trained with, by the way, I was the student there in the theater academy in the conservatory, many of his actors taught me, and they had all been acting with Strehler for 30 or 40 years as a team. And it was very clear to me that they had never done any work outside of their work with Strehler to even hold a candle to that work. So that Strehler had a gift for bringing the best out of those around him. No question.
So I want to ask you something that you prompted a thought in, which I try to explain to people, and I think most people just don't get it. Right. And I think we have never discussed this because I scarcely know you, though I feel I do. I think it's something that you will have experienced, and therefore I want to talk about it with you. Especially during this pandemic period, when I've been very cut off for all the obvious reasons. I've not been out in the world, and I'm very much out in the world normally. One of the things I really miss is my Italian friendships. I'm not talking about Italian food. I can do that at home. I'm not talking about beautiful art and so on, though, yes, that too. But there's a particular nature to friendships with Italians that is very different from the friendships I have elsewhere in the world. And I have friendships in everywhere, even France. I have friends. I love the French, you know what I mean? But it's a different kind of relationship. They're good friends in France, but it's a very formal, cerebral kind of thing. Yes. But with my Italian friendships, it goes so deep. And it's kind of like once you've passed a certain threshold, you are completely bonded and you are connected in thought and emotion and so on. And I don't see that happening much in America, where our popular culture describes friendship as more like pounding each other on the back and drinking a beer, or becoming a little weepy and emotional, but it's not the ongoing personal emotional dialogue that I've found in Italian friendships. And I have friendships in Italy, male and female, that go back decades. Yes. And they're more intense now than ever, even though I don't see these people very often. Would you talk about your experience of how you interact with Italians and Italians interact? Because I think fundamentally this explains how Strehler directed. Wow, Fred, that's beautiful. I absolutely have experienced all the same things that you speak about, and I miss Italy, but I miss the life of the piazza. You know, I miss Italians are extremely social animals, and they are they need one another's physical presence, you know. And my friends, look, just to say that Giorgio Strehler, when he saw over 1,000 candidates, and he chose 30 of us to be his students. And he took us through 3 years of the academy. So we didn't have second year students. You know, we were, unlike Marceau's school, where I was in the second year and first year students arrived. No, we were the students for 3 years. We were graduated, and then a new group came. So there was a total dedication to us while we were there. And we were known as the Copeau group. So interesting, he chose Jacques Copeau as his founding father. There would later be a Stanislavski group, a Louis Jouvet group, Bertolt Brecht group. But those men and women now, we were boys and girls. I mean, we were young. The youngest of us was about 16, and the oldest, I was among the older ones. So Mace, keep talking. I see. There you go.
Yeah,
Just
forgive
keep
me.
talking.
That was it. Yeah, okay. That was
It's
a
like on
call.
the stage. Keep talking. Keep
Forgive me.
singing.
Okay. So what I was going to say, the youngest of us was about 16. I was among the older ones at around, I was 24 when I entered.
Mhm.
But what I wanted to say is that somehow, magically, George Ostrahler did not simply cast us. Yes, there was a tall man and a shorter man. And yes, there was, we were physical types in a certain way to round out a group. But what he saw in us, I'm convinced of this, he felt in each of us a kind of kindred spirit. He recognized in each of us a kind of artistic family. And every single one of us continues to marvel. Here we are 31 years later. We graduated in 1990. We still feel as brothers and sisters. It's inexplicable. Of course, we shared, we lived, ate, and slept our artistic experience together there. But it's more than that, because I did that with Marceau's school as well and bonded with those people. And I have lifelong friends there too. But somehow George Ostrahler recognized in each and every one of us a kind of family kinship. So the relation I have with those 30 or so human beings is extraordinary. And over the years, some of us, as life does, some of us have gone through challenges. We seem to rally our troops to provide succor and strength and support to one another. We are absolutely an artistic family, and we owe that to George Ostrahler, who, oddly enough, by the way, he was not particularly a pedagogue, nor was Marcel Marceau. We learned from them by being with them, by watching them at work, by engaging with them, by being in the workshop of the master craftsman.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it was. I'm not sure, did I begin to answer your question?
You did, but if you would talk a little more about the nature of friendships in Italy and how it differs from the nature of friendships in the States, and how that mutuality is a word I'll pick, winds up in a Ostrahler production. How the bonding, how the trust, how the intimacy is different from how, let's call it, theater intimacy and trust happens on a stage in America.
Wow.
Or Britain.
Well, let me just say, wow, that's really, well, first of all, let's start here. When we worked on Faust, it was 8 or 9 months. And every second, every minute of those months was put to use. We were never, time was valuable and precious, but also we were always engaged. Every moment we were in the theater with Strahler. Here we try to, the ludicrous proposition here, I'm a Shakespearean actor, having done, I don't know, 13, 14, 15, 16 different plays over the years. We attempt to put on a Shakespeare play in a matter of weeks. It's ludicrous. So let's talk a little bit about cooking. The meal doesn't begin when you start chopping the vegetables. It begins when the moment you begin thinking about what it is you want to create,
And then
you
go to the market
market
and see what the market has.
All of that. So what I'm trying to say is, at the Piccolo Teatro, from the moment you entered the theater, you were already part of a theatrical world. It's not just that you went in, got your seat, and waited for a curtain to rise. somehow you were ushered into a world of theater. And this, by the way, if we get to talking about circus, right, there's a kind of all-embracing quality to it. And so, I mean, with with the friendships as well, I don't even want to call it a level of trust and intimacy. It's, you know, there are certain human beings with whom we feel as if we could express anything and be at home.
Mhm.
And I felt that at the Piccolo Teatro, that, you know, the stakes were very high, and tempers might flare, and, you know, let's say the discussions or disagreements could run into the wee hours of the morning, but there was always this sense of a profound respect for one another, and a profound shared love for whatever it was we were involved in. I guess I can also say I had this experience in France also, but I loved those communally created meals also, right? In other words, where friends would gather and create a meal together at one another's sides. Maybe
I'm
you're
laughing
thinking
because my experience was just a bit different. It was always, let Fred cook. There was nothing communal about it. We'll sit and drink, and when Fred serves the food, we'll eat it.
and we know that it will be lovely.
Yeah, but I mean, maybe so, but at least, you know, it was not communal. And it frankly was also, I wanted people out of the kitchen so I could just focus and create a proper meal.
Well, let's also be clear. When Giorgio Strehler was directing a play, there was one director.
Yes, let Giorgio cook.
Let Giorgio cook, but if you arrived one day to rehearsal and you'd been asked to bring ripe tomatoes to the play, but you arrived instead with the most fragrant melon that had ever been seen, Giorgio Strehler would stop and say, wait a minute, the play is now about a melon. Okay, everything has changed, you know, because this actor has just brought me something so fragrant and so wonderful. And so I never realized that the play was about a melon, but now I realize it's about a melon. So we need to, you know, and so he had a great capacity to be, let us say, to appreciate the full depth and breadth of what he had before him. So he would never dream of trying to direct one actor as if he was directing another. In other words, this is a good example. In The Servant of Two Masters, over the decades, one actor would replace another actor in a role. And let's say the role of Pantalone, the old man, the father, the merchant of Venice, Pantalone, the Venetian merchant. Often, you know, an actor, Nico Pepe, whom I had the great privilege to work with briefly before he passed, Nico Pepe played that role for 19 years. Well, at a certain point, someone took his place. Never in a million years would Strehler say, well, Nico used to do this and Nico used to do that. No. Now we have a completely new creature here. I'm not going to try to make a melon into a tomato. So you have brought something, you bring what is special in you. So he had this gift.
I'm just gonna you know, I'm gonna hold Goldoni for later because he gets his own special conversation here. But keep going.
Yes, no, Goldoni, yes, and then Goldoni in general, because I have at home, for anyone who's curious, I have the 14 volumes of Goldoni's collected works. You know, hundreds of plays. But then there's the special case of The Servant of Two Masters, otherwise known as Arlecchino in Strehler's universe, which he first directed in the very first year of the Piccolo Teatro in 1947, and which he was still directing at his death 50 years later. So the whole story of Arlecchino, and let me
But
put
we'll
a
get
little
to
plug in.
Goldoni and Arlecchino later, okay?
Yes, for
Because
later.
I want to stick to other things. Let me now
So,
jump in for a bit and talk about
yes,
Streller, the opera director,
yes,
because it's interesting, Mace, that you and I knew the same man, probably experienced many of the same attitudes and strengths that he had, and a couple of vulnerabilities and so on. And yet the requirement in front of him was different when you were with him than it was for me. Streller, as you said, founded the Piccolo Teatro with Grassi in 1947. It opened on May 14th of 1947. And it's important because after World War II, and then the foundation of the new Italian Republic on June 2nd, 1946, the first thing the Milanese did, when, as you said, literally there was still blood on the walls, and the city center was in rubble. La Scala had been largely destroyed. The first thing that the people of Milan did was rebuild La Scala very quickly. And it opened on May 11th of 1946. In other words, a year and 3 days before the foundation of the Piccolo. And Arturo Toscanini conducted a concert, and Renata Tebaldi sang, and it was obviously a major event that exists on a CD that people can hear. And so when that was in place, then the Milanese began to clear the rubble and build and rebuild much of the city and take the art treasures out of storage and put them back in the museums. The city center, much of it near the Piazza del Duomo, had a medieval core, much of it which was destroyed and rebuilt in its own fashion. And near there on Via Broletto is where the Piccolo Teatro was founded. But Streller, in that year of 47, directed The Lower Depths by Gorky, and then he directed Arlecchino. But then he went to La Scala and directed La Traviata.
yes,
So, therefore, what we see with Giorgio Streller was this young director, affermato, as the Italians would say, affirmed, qualified, recognized, already was brought to La Scala when the paint was not even dry,
yes,
and directed La Traviata, and simultaneously had a career directing prose theater and comedy and all kinds of things, but also directing opera.
yes,
And as I mentioned, his grandfather, I believe, was one of the leaders of the Teatro Verdi in Trieste. And he studied music, and he was predestined for an artistic career that evolved as you've begun to explain, and I've explained a bit. But he understood that the conventions and the requirements of opera, as seen then, were different. And one of the leading opera directors was Luchino Visconti, who had a young protege and companion in the romantic sense, Franco Zeffirelli, who then went off on his own. And so while Streller was doing what he did, you had Visconti creating these ornate, gorgeous, theatrically incisive productions for Maria Callas and others. And you had Tullio Serafin and other conductors really lifting La Scala musically. And the 1950s were a golden age at La Scala. And Streller did direct there periodically, but it was really Visconti and a little bit Zeffirelli and a number of others. But he in the 50s was doing some opera, but really forming the Piccolo Teatro, what it became, and doing a lot of Bertolt Brecht in the 1950s, and they had a relationship. But then he turned more to opera. And he said to me that opera can say things that the Teatro di Prosa, the prose theater, cannot.
mm-hmm.
And that's because it has to be said differently. And I asked him, what brought you to the opera in a more definitive way? And he said, when I realized it did not have to be staged the way people saw it with Visconti and Zeffirelli, which was not to knock them at
Yes,
all. They were very admirable, but that Giorgio felt that it had to be done a little differently. And to me, the great breakthrough that he understood, that he taught me, that he drilled into me repeatedly was operatic gesture does not necessarily have to be the conventional gestures of opera that people are used to. Quando cambi il gesto, cambi il testo, he's used to say. When you change the gesture, you change the texture, not the text, but the texture. La tessitura, really. But he always said gesto e testo because it rhymed. And he basically would sit with me with the score, but also with the libretto, but really the score, and say, what gestures do you see happening here? What is she doing? Where is her hand? Does her hand have to do anything special, or can her hand just be at her side because maybe she doesn't have to do this or that or this? Maybe the hand is just at the side because she's meditative. And I got to collaborate with him on a few productions, but specifically the revival of Simone Boccanegra, which he had me do a lot of the staging of, and the creation in 1975 of his famous Verdi Macbeth production. And I'll explain that in 1975, I was a student in Bologna at the DAMS, Dipartimento di Arte, Musica e Spettacolo, which is Italy's Juilliard. And I'd already worked with Zeffirelli. And Zeffirelli, who a lot of people said a lot of bad things about him, but he was also very mentorish and encouraging to people who were serious, called up Strehler and said, I want you to have this young man at your rehearsals for Macbeth, because he knows my style. I want him to see your style. And so I got to be at the creation of this Macbeth production in 75, even though I was living in Bologna, but I went to Milan. And it was unlike any opera production I'd ever seen, because basically he was infused with Shakespeare, but he was infused with Verdi's music. And the great breakthrough, I'd never seen this before because I'd never heard microphones in an opera before. It was Piero Capuccilli was Macbeth, and Shirley Verrett, magnificent as Lady Macbeth. And in the famous scene, Nel Dì della Vittoria, where she reads the text and then says, ambizioso spirito tu sei Macbetto. Normally, and when Callas did it was great, Nel Dì della Vittoria, and she would read it and then pause. And then ambizioso spirito. What Strehler had done was a recording of, some say it was Capuccilli, some say it was Strehler, reading the letter, and Shirley Verrett standing on the stage. And she had, in effect, memorized the letter. And it was in her head. We're talking about the interior life before. It was in her head. So then her body changed, ambizioso spirito tu sei Macbetto. I'm not a singer. And it changed everything. It revolutionized that whole evening, because you understood that it was the inner conflict and urgings and passions of Lady Macbeth that drove the story, and not Macbeth himself.
Yes.
And that was done on an empty stage. And I remember that at one of the performances where Verrett did it, the audience went wild, and this was the first act, and started throwing roses and things on the stage, and she just stood there. And I believe there's a pirate video on YouTube perhaps, but she just stood there remaining in character. Many opera singers would, nod and thank you. No,
right.
She was pelted with these roses, and she just stood there, and at a certain point moved the gown in such a way, expanding her arm. And I said to Giorgio, the way she expanded her arm like that, and he said, perché occupa tutto, because she occupies, or she takes over everything. And he had not directed her to expand her arm that way, because who knew she'd be pelted with roses. But this was Verrett's understanding of the character, without saying a word. She was a mime, and just continuing the opera. Now, when I was, in effect, taken under Strehler's wing, officially I reported to him, and I loved it. But I also had the immense honor and experience to be simultaneously in the world of Claudio Abbado. Now, you were talking about Paolo Grassi. There were different administrators of La Scala, Cesare Mazzonis and others, but in effect, Abbado was the artistic and music director, and Strehler, I don't know what the official title was, but he was the person who formed the La Scala visual aesthetic in the 1970s and early 80s. When Abbado left and Riccardo Muti came in,
Yes.
they bonded. Muti revered Strehler.
Yes.
I know that we're going to talk about this later. You were involved and witnessed or knew the 1987 Don Giovanni.
Yes.
I did not. I was working at the Met then. But in the 70s, it was this intesa, this feeling between two men, between Abbado and Strehler, that we all benefited from because they did not have to speak very much. Abbado was not the most verbal man, but he was the one. He was the chef. He was everything.
May I interject?
Yeah.
Intesa.
Yeah.
Just because you were talking earlier about Italian friendship, intesa is such a beautiful word and essentially untranslatable. I mean, but it captures, it's an interesting thing, intesa.
Yeah.
And under a mutual understanding.
Yeah, it is, but it's more.
It's much more.
It's a bond.
It's a bond.
Yeah. And they had that in Tesa. I don't claim to have had it with either man because they were these godly figures, even though they were very believers in proletariat and egalitarian and so on. But they had vision, that extraordinary vision. And when you put the two of them together, and I will add a third character who you would not expect, maybe, Giorgio Armani. Giorgio Armani was then a young man and came to Milan from Piacenza, and he too was breaking away from the extravagant in Italian fashion and going for the essential. And his costumes, his awareness of the physique, and when I say costumes, also clothing for people, yes, he could design the gown or whatever, or the beautiful tuxedo, but he made everyone look better. And Abbado made everybody sound better, and Strehler made everybody move and act and think better. And so there was this ferment there at a time that were also known as the Anni di Piombo. There was huge rebellion in Italy and social strife. And these men, although they were at La Scala and the Piccolo and were august figures in their way, were right down there in the streets with the workers. And Abbado brought opera to jails, and Abbado wanted planting of trees at a time when no one spoke about that for the environment. And so there was this dynamism to Milanese culture that later, I think it's in a better place now, but it calcified for a while and became self-regarding, and everything was about fanciness and wealth and so on. But in the 70s, there was this edge that apparently New York had. I wasn't here, but apparently New York had, in a very edgy way, in a creative way, but Milan had it too. And therefore you could do a Simone Boccanegra, which is about family relations, but also about pushing out the people in control, or Macbeth, which was about a certain kind of insanity and maniacal craving for power at any cost. And the Strehler productions of those two things did not have much scenery. I won't say it was bare. It was not a German type bare stage. But everything that was there was essential. There might have been one sail in Simone Boccanegra, which he also used in The Tempest, the Shakespeare Tempest in 1978, which I was involved with too. And I'm going to add another figure in addition to the guys I mentioned. Well, there was also Carla Fracci, Carla Fracci was the leading ballerina and La Scala Corps de Ballet, and she too had the political sentiments of especially Abbado. They were very, very close. And so even La Scala Ballet had a certain political element while doing magnificent performances. But the guy I want to add is Dario Fo. Was of the same vintage and went on to win a Nobel Prize for Literature, which was much discussed. He was an actor. He was a man who embraced theatrical traditions such as circus and bus and truck and so on. And in 1979, Strehler did what Zeffirelli did. Strehler said, I want you to go work on a production with Dario Fo, and you can learn from him things that you will not have learned from me and some of the Pizzi and Zeffirelli and so forth. And so Fo did a production of La Storia del Soldato, L'Histoire del Soldat by Stravinsky at the Teatro Nazionale. And Dario Fo spoke he spoke beautiful Italian, but he often spoke in a sort of gibberish Milanese dialect that was kind of like having my grandfather speak to me in Yiddish. And because we knew what he was saying, but you had to listen very closely. Strehler spoke fast, especially as he got older. When you look at films and hear him acting, he would speak in the past in a more measured way. But as he got older, I think the mind moved faster, and he did not necessarily enunciate because the mind was moving so fast. Of course, he could speak beautifully. But Fo deliberately spoke in a kind of gibberish that made everybody listen. And his theater was a theater of surprise. It was the theater of thumbing your nose at certain people in authority, but at the same time, talking about the most serious political issues of his time. Mistero Buffo was an example of that. And did you encounter Fo? Did you work with Fo at all in that era when these people were all in Milan?
I met Dario Fo in a summer festival of Commedia dell'arte in 1986. And I was then a Stanford University student spending the summer abroad studying Commedia dell'arte. I had the good fortune to be in the same hotel with him for a weekend. So I was the young American that he wanted to impress. I'm telling you, he invited me out to dinner and had me sit next to him, by his side, because it was very important for him to, on the other side was the mayor of the town. It was the Festa dell'Unità, so it was a Communist Party celebration. And I was his young American acolyte. Of course, I mean, it's very interesting because the story I have about Dario Fo, it's a silly little story, really, but I came down for breakfast the morning after. He did a one-man show of Commedia, which I found less useful than a lot of the other things I had seen. But, he was a great animal of the stage, Dario Fo. And I came down for breakfast and he was there writing. And I said hello and we greeted each other. And he looked at me very theatrically and he said, do you know what I'm doing? We spoke in French, by the way. I don't think I spoke Italian at the time. 86. No, maybe I anyway. I think he was speaking to me in French, but he said, do you know what I'm doing? I said, no, I'm writing a comedy. And it was sort of that, it hung in the air. And I thought, that's nice, I know that he wanted me to suddenly swoon, I said, okay. He said, I'm finishing the second act. I thought, well, okay, So what was funny for me was, as a young, I would have been 23, he had the expectation that by the end of the weekend, he would have utterly seduced me, as, artistically seduced me, right? As a young actor, he would be my new hero. And instead, I kind of just was there, interested, but not. So I will never forget, and I hope I'm not speaking ill of the dead, may he rest in peace. He was a brilliant man and a brilliant artist and creative, dynamic creator. But when we left each other at the end of the weekend, he said, it's been such a pleasure to to meet you. And he didn't look me in the eye. And I just thought, the actor in me registered kind of the narcissism of the experience. But having said that, of course, as a young man, I was very unfair. Dario Fo, no question, was a genius. But what's interesting, for instance, to me, I don't know, to raise this thought for our audience, I'm a great fan of Pirandello, another Nobel Prize winner.
Luigi Pirandello, Sicilian playwright, 6 characters in search of an author, right? Yes. If you think you are, yeah.
So Luigi Pirandello and Dario Fo.
Enrico IV, actually, which Strehler loved.
Yes.
Yeah.
But in between these 2 Nobel Prize winning men of the theater in Italy was a man whom I absolutely revere, whom Strehler also knew and worked with, an utter genius of the theater, who to me should have won the Nobel Prize, right? You may know who I'm speaking of, is a Neapolitan named Edoardo De Filippo.
Yeah.
So just to say with Dario Fo, and not to diminish Dario Fo, but the plays of Edoardo De Filippo, genius actor as he was. I mean, Laurence Olivier was fascinated by De Filippo as an actor and a playwright. De Filippo's plays will be performed 100 years from now, I'm convinced, where in some sense, the greatest performer of Dario Fo's plays was always Dario Fo. To me, that kind of gets at the essence of, the difference between the 2 artists. But, and of course, Dario Fo's approach, we've held it at bay here, the Commedia dell'arte. Dario Fo's
now let's go
the
there, because I want to go, I know that that's at your heart.
Yes.
I'm just going to briefly say 2 things about Commedia dell'arte and then hand off to you. In my view, at least, it did not begin in Venice in the 18th century, but it has its roots going all the way back to ancient Rome and evolved through the centuries and became something else that we came to know in Venice and nearby in the 18th century as the Venetian Republic was declining gloriously and fell in 1797 to the French. But the leading exponent was Carlo Goldoni, who we'll talk about. But then Commedia dell'arte continued and actually evolved into opera.
Yes.
And that's where, with Donizetti comedies, for example, would be very famous for that. Rossini somewhat too, but really Donizetti. But talk about Commedia dell'arte, and would you also include the whole thing of circus in Italy?
Yes.
And the traveling player. Let's use that word. Long before Shakespeare had traveling players, Italy had traveling players.
Well, first of all, just to say that anything I say about Commedia dell'arte, the opposite could be argued. The Commedia dell'arte is a river, broad and deep, centuries of theater making. So, the golden age of Commedia dell'arte, somewhere from 1550 to 1750. But if you think about 200 years in the theater, my goodness, that's a long run, So
that's a production of Cats.
Well, when I tell people that hello, Andrew Lloyd Webber, wherever you are. You think he's listening, Fred?
No,
I doubt it. No, I don't think so. But just to say, most people, if they know about Commedia dell'arte, they think of it in a sort of reductive way. In other words, they think of these characters, Arlecchino, Arlequin, Harlequin, Pantalone, Pantalon, Pantaloon. They think of these characters as sort of stereotypes. And instead, I would encourage people to think of them as human archetypes, meaning they are much larger than life. They are larger than life beings who have inhabited the subconscious and the subconscious minds and the imaginations of artists for hundreds of years. And when I say artists also, let's not forget Picasso, in the visual arts. These characters move their way through everything from the history of European painting, certainly through opera, certainly through the theater of Molière and Shakespeare, but also through vaudeville in the Marx Brothers, and through Looney Tunes. The catalog, Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck are Harlequin, Arlecchino and Brighella. They are the second, let's say Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny are like the first and second Zannis. By the way, zany, for our audience, zany humor, which they used to use for the Marx Brothers, zany. It comes from the Venetian name Zani, Zan or Zani, which would be Giovanni, like a jack of all trades, like Shakespeare's fools who are often called a jack or a knave.
Like Figaro in The Barber of Seville.
Absolutely. Figaro.
And Beaumarchais took those characters in that direction.
So the point is, the Commedia dell'arte characters, I like to think of them almost as primary colors that then are mixed in so many different combinations by different artists of the theater, of the opera, of in visual art, and in the circus too. I just spent a season with the Zoppe Circus, Zoppe. Interestingly, I don't know, is it fate, Fred? You'll have to tell me. But Giovanni Zoppe, known as Nino, the clown, Giovannino, his father, Alberto Zoppe, was from what part of Italy? The Veneto. He was from Vittorio Veneto. So
which
here
is where
I am.
Lorenzo Dal Ponte was from.
Yes.
Yep.
Who was Lorenzo Dal Ponte, whom people know as Mozart's librettist, but let us not forget that he founded the Italian language department at Columbia University.
I know that because I went to Columbia and my job was to be the custodian of those books. I read them all.
There we go. Yep. So Lorenzo da Ponte of the Veneto Republic, Jewish, arrives in New York. I mean, you can't make these things up. But anyway, what was I saying? That I've been working with the Zoppe Circus and with a gifted clown, a gifted poet. Let me call him that. Giovanni is not listening at the moment because he's probably performing in rehearsal or performing. But he and I played together in a pandemic-friendly circus last year, which was a drive-in circus. And we will be playing again from this September through the end of January in California and Arizona.
And I want to say I watched a video of that in preparation. It was beautiful.
Oh, God bless you, Fred.
Yep.
Because here's the deal. Here's the deal, Fred. You began our conversation by saying opera, theater, opera, right? Giovanni and I joke.
But then I said circus too.
You threw it in, circus. But here's the point. Giovanni was born, his mother gave birth in the parking lot of Bozo the Clown. So Giovanni is the thing itself. Let me say, he is like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the natural man. Giovanni was born in the circus, has lived in the circus, and God bless him, when it comes time for him to pass into another world, will pass in the circus. I know. So the miracle, but here's the thing, Fred. Giovanni came, I invited him to come see Strehler's Arlecchino in Chicago when we were on tour in 2005 in Chicago. He saw the show, laughed and cried, like the cliche. I laughed, I cried. after the show, he came out to dinner with all of us. He said, "You stole the show from our circus. Everything I saw in the show came from us." So we had this wonderful bonding moment where we realized, oh my God, the trunks in Arlecchino, you see the trunk in Giovanni's circus. The lazzi, which are little bits of comic business, between the first clown and the second clown, you see them between Brighella and Arlecchino. In other words, here's a man who never, I don't know if he spent a day, quote unquote, studying theater, but he has lived in the circus all his life. He has this in his DNA. So in other words, when he sees Commedia dell'arte, he recognizes it. And just to say, there's a little routine that Giovanni and I do between, I'm the big brother clown, and he's the little brother. He's the child, and I'm the adult, right? And in many ways, my function as the ringmaster is to keep the child in check, in order. And let's think for a moment, for those of you old enough to remember, for those of you fans of I Love Lucy, you know, you've got Ricky the band leader, and Lucy the grown-up child, right? And Lucy wants to be in every act. And Nino the clown, essentially, whenever he sees a man being shot out of a cannon, he wants to climb into the cannon and be shot out of the cannon. He sees the lady on the trapeze, he wants to climb the trapeze. Of course, he's such a gifted artist. In order to do something badly, you have to be able to do it very well. So a lot of his comedy comes from, you know, fabulous screw-ups, you know. But my job on the stage is to sort of say, no, 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 you can't do that. And of course, he, the child, always wins. So the children in the audience adore seeing the innocent clown win over the grown-up, you know, the serious clown. And that's in the very structure, in the nature of the beast, going all the way back to the Greeks and beyond, in the nature of comic, you know, duos. It's so fascinating to me that somehow, you know, we have these films, Dumb and Dumber, you know, silent comedy, you have Laurel and Hardy, you have Abbott and Costello. We have the serious
George
clown.
Burns, Gracie Allen.
Yes.
Yeah.
So George Burns, by the
Abbott
way,
and Costello, yeah.
Yeah, here's a fascinating little thing for those who are fascinated. Some will not be, but I find this fascinating. In vaudeville, we talk about the straight man. We call him the straight man and the sidekick. There's a term, the sidekick. And the side, so in the Commedia dell'arte, you can look up engravings from the 1700s, and you'll see Arlecchino leaning on the shoulder of the straight man. So in other words, Brighella, the grown-up clown, has to be a pillar. And the silly clown is leaning on his, you know, on his stability, right? Frustrating him a great deal because, you know, as children do, they frustrate their school teachers, they frustrate their adults, but thank God for them, because in their folly, they are, you know, forever creative forces, right?
I'm going to name two more.
And that is Harlequin.
I'm going to name two more that are outgrowth of that. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza.
Yes.
And Don Giovanni and Leporello.
Yes. And by the way, let us not forget Leporello. Oh, before we get to Leporello, I was saying the straight man and the sidekick. In Italian, the straight man's name is La Spalla. He's called the shoulder. He's called the shoulder. He's the shoulder you lean on, right? Anyway, I thought that was amazing. But Leporello,
except that at least the two examples I just gave, and maybe there are others.
Yes.
The sidekick, the second banana, is often the strength to the Spalla, because, for example, Leporello reinforces Don Giovanni. Sancho Panza holds up Don Quixote.
Well, lest we, of course, when you're looking at Don Quixote and you're looking at Don Giovanni, now we've got a whole other archetype, not the two servants, not the older brother, younger brother, a little bit of that, but more importantly, we have the commedia character of the capitano, the captain, who is both a dreamer, an idealist, and somehow also a failure. Somehow he is both. My goodness. Yes, Don Juan, who, by the way, at Purchase Summer Fair Festival, they had a Don Juan summer, where they had Moliere's play, they had Mozart's opera, but the number of Spanish plays, and my goodness, I mean, the character of Don Juan or Don Giovanni travels through European theater.
There was Tirso de la Molina before Moliere was Tirso de la Molina. Yeah.
Tirso de Molina, and also, there were a number of Commedia dell'arte versions. They called the play Don Juan or the Atheist Struck by Lightning. In Italy, they had to make sure that the good moral epilogue, you can have as much.
Well, no, actually, for the opera, it's Il dissoluto punito, the dissolute man punished.
Exactly. Yeah. The atheist burnt to a crisp. It's yeah. But there were so many versions of this story. But the point being that Don Giovanni or Don Juan, there was a fabulous Italian actor named Francesco Andreini, who was more or less contemporary with Cervantes, who was writing Quixote. They both fought against the Turks in the wars around Cyprus. And let us not forget, Othello is right in that same little nexus of, the crusades of these, you could claim that Othello and Iago, he belongs right there with, it's a tragic, it's a very tragic, it's a dark interpretation, but it's that same relationship that we're talking about between master and servant. But Moliere's sidekick, Sganarelle, I was just saying before, Leporello means little hare, right? Lepore. Yeah, and there we are, Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny. He's the little hare. I swear to God, I can't make these things up. The dottore from Bologna, who is a doctor of medicine some days and a doctor of law other times. He reads from the same book and he turns it over depending on which way he reads it. He has 487 PhDs at last count, and nobody can understand a word he says, right? He is full of... And
these characters exist in Rossini and Mozart, Così fan tutte, when Destina dresses up as...
The windbag, absolutely. Right. I mean, the dottore, absolutely, and also as, think about in, what's the opera, Mio Babbino Caro.
Gianni Schicchi.
You've got a windbag there too, right? You've got these famous windbags. So the dottore from Bologna is, we have an expression. I mean, Fred, you love cuisine. This may be a great note to close on, but I'm not there yet. I'll stay as long as you will stay.
Well, I'm not closing. I know what you're going to say.
The dottore is full of bologna. He's full of bologna.
No, when you say you're from Bologna, la dotta, the wise.
Yes.
La grassa, the well-fed, and la rossa, the red, the left wing.
Oh, I love that.
You didn't know that?
No.
La dotta, in other words, Bologna, but also its citizens. La dotta, la grassa, la rossa.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, because I do want to be a little mindful on time, I have about 20 more minutes. I just want to say things for concision, namely that Carlo Goldoni was Italy's perhaps greatest playwright, and that it was Giorgio Strehler who exalted Goldoni and brought him to his full prominence. When I was studying with Strehler, I was actually living many nights in Pavia, which is south of Milan, at the Collegio Ghislieri, where an
The old
American
stomping ground.
of Goldoni, where an American
Yes.
is admitted every second year on a Fulbright scholarship, and that's how I got to Strehler. And I was in room 12, and they keep track of who was in different rooms. Goldoni slept in room 12, probably in the same uncomfortable bed that I slept in.
That is,
he was there in
that,
1723.
I mean, that requires a little moment for me to actually absorb and digest. I slept in Jacques Copeau's bed, by the way. That's another story.
Yeah.
But that's amazing. Amazing.
Well, the other famous figure in room 12 was Alessandro Volta, who created or described voltage.
Amazing.
And so the Collegio Ghislieri is a very special spot. But
yeah,
so Goldoni was in Pavia, south of Milan.
Yeah.
He obviously at that time, Italy was not a nation, it was a series of city-states.
Yes.
And Milan was under Austria and France, and Venice was still a republic at that time, but fell to Goldoni died in 1793 in Paris, and Venice fell to the French in 1797. But Goldoni, let's see if you agree or disagree. I think that Goldoni was in some ways a reaction to what was received as the classic Italian literary and linguistic style, which was Tuscan. And because Goldoni was Venetian and he spoke and wrote in Italian, we would say borghese, in a bourgeois, in the conversational style. I used a word more than an hour ago, charlar, this learned sociable chatter.
Yes.
That's typical of the Adriatic from Trieste to Venice. And his characters delight in wordplay.
Yes.
And in spontaneity, in a way that the Tuscans, who love puns, by the way, but it's a little more cardinal Italian for the Tuscans. Just the way Tuscan art is formal, it's structured, it's rational. Venetian art is about light and color.
Well, let's say just as Dante chose to write in Tuscan rather than Latin, Goldoni chose to write in Venetian most of the time rather than Tuscan, simply because it was truly his mother tongue. In other words, I think the spontaneous, now we're back to the ear of the young Giorgio Strehler sitting at the table of his family, having meals at age 5, 6, 7 years old, and hearing German, and hearing a Slavic language, and hearing French, and hearing Venetian. And so
Triestino.
I think the young Goldoni, what's that?
Triestino. Yeah.
Yes, I think the young Goldoni absorbed Venetian in a way, even when he wrote in Tuscan, he was almost translating from Venetian to write in Tuscan Italian because his soul, he heard the world in Venetian. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, towards the end of life, he became an exile. He went to live in France, and he was writing his last plays in French and also translating earlier plays into French. But of course, his writing in French could never compare to his writing in his native Venetian, I would argue. I mean, that was where his heart was.
I think there's an important story to tell about all the great Italian creative artists who went to France, got sick, and died.
Oh my
Bellini,
God.
Donizetti got sick in France when they dragged him home to Bergamo. And
wow,
Rossini,
I didn't know that story.
Oh yeah, that's for another time. But Donizetti was a tragic life that I like to recount. You and I will have to open a bottle of wine.
The French always like to say, "Oh no, the French are always so proud. We own Yves Montand, and we own
Yves Montand, Ivo Evi from Livorno."
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the great Jean-Baptiste Lully was in fact Giambattista Lully.
From Florence. Yeah.
Yes.
No, I
Yeah.
know. And, you know, the Italians taught the French to cook, to eat, to grow wine, to paint.
Yeah.
Catherine de Medici civilized them a bit.
Yeah.
And by the way, Catherine de Medici, I love this detail, was the mother of Elizabeth de Valois, who is Elisabetta in Verdi's opera Don Carlo. People don't know that. Yeah. Yeah. So this brings me back to Streller, which is important. My feeling about him is that you were talking before, you used the word ringmaster for the circus. And to me, that's a certain kind of director. I knew Fellini. I got to work with Fellini, and Fellini was a genius ringmaster.
Yes.
Streller could be the ringmaster, but I think that Streller was also the director who was the dramaturg, the interpreter of text. In my case, also the interpreter of music as a parallel dialogue to character with the text itself. Ella Jamai Mamo in Don Carlo would be She Never Loved Me, but is it the music? Is it the cello accompaniment? Is it the words? She Never Loved Me. It's all of that together.
It's all of that. May I ask you too, did you work with or know Marie's Flash?
No.
So because Marie's Flash, I would argue, like Lennon and McCartney, on the one hand, there was this great partnership, Strehler-Grassi, but the other unsung, and God bless you, Maryse, wherever you are right now. I hope you're listening. She's no longer here with us. She was an absolute genius of the body in the theater. She trained under Etienne de Creux, who was the mime who taught Marcel Marceau. She was an absolute genius of finding, as you were talking about, finding the perfect gesture for the character in the moment, in the situation. I would argue that Arlecchino would never have existed, you know, this production of Commedia dell'arte with all its brilliance would never have been what it became were it not for Strehler's partner always by his side, because Strehler, just as you pointed out, he was fascinated by how the text lives in the body of the actor in character. And so he was always engaged in a very close reading of the text, but he needed Maryse by his side to say, Maryse, what if we did this? What if we did that? Give me an idea. Show me what can the character do at this moment? What can I do? And she combined, you know, the knowledge, the embodied knowledge of a mime with a profound understanding also of dance and acrobatics. But she was, as you say with Paolo Grassi, unless you worked at the Piccolo Teatro, you would never know. You would never realize that there was this absolutely genius collaborator who was there by his side at all times.
Well, you see,
so she was my teacher.
I see. I had access, obviously, to the Piccolo, and I was allowed to attend performances and rehearsals. But frankly, I was at La Scala. And it's not that one was better than the other, not at all. And I love going to the plays. And I would say that his production of The Tempest changed my view of so many things more than any other. The Cherry Orchard to some degree, but it was really The Tempest that just changed my vision of how theater could be done and how that could be applied to opera. But I was on the opera side because as I explained. So therefore, the concept of gesture is different because the timing, il tempismo, in opera is governed by the music, ultimately. Yes. Whereas in a play, you can really slow it down, you can speed it up. There are things that the tempo is in the speech of the actors and the movement,
and
not in opera.
And nonetheless, let me tell you, Strehler thought of the text, of the written word, the spoken word, as a kind of musical score. And he always, which in America, as an actor in America, that's a language I don't get to speak with many American directors because they don't know how to go there. It shall remain nameless, but let me just say, I recently saw a Zoom production of King Lear in which the protagonist more or less shouted his entire way through the production. I mean, it was terrifying to me. But the point being that language is music. Language is music.
Mm-hmm.
And Shakespeare's language, you know, above all others, is musical. And so Strehler always was interested in the music of the spoken text. And also, he would cast an actor in a role as an oboe or a violin or a piccolo. He knew that the play was made up of different instrumental voices, and he thought often of actors as if they were musical instruments in the play. That's just one level of what he did, because of course you could never reduce the performance to that. But just to say that the operatic director brought all his musical sensitivities to directing in the theater, you know,
And I'm going to
and
say
probably vice
this.
versa.
I'm going to say this, and I don't want a response because we don't have time, but this is just my
Yes.
opinion. Not every great opera director is a great theater director, and not every great theater director is a great opera director. Some few are, but again, I'm not going to name names because there are people I admire greatly when they're in
Right.
one camp, but not in the other.
Yes.
Before we go, I want to mention one thing for our listeners, that if you are lucky enough to be in Milan, and I'm not, and I guess you're not, tomorrow is the 100th anniversary of Strehler's birth, and they will be releasing a postage stamp of the Great Artist series of the Italian Postal Service, which does deliver. And so you may want to get a commemorative stamp. A website has been set up, giorgiostrehler.it, giorgiostrehler.it, that will be the gathering spot for all the activities regarding the centennial observances. There are many roundtables and books being published, and events. There will be on October 1st in Milan, and I can't be there, a night of Strehler. And Italy, especially Milan, is going alla grande, as the Italians say, to observe who he was. And even in the context of the pandemic, he will be commemorated in an important way starting tomorrow.
Fred.
But, yes, sir.
Yeah, let me also mention that I am hoping, it is still in the only formative stage, but we're hoping at some point over the next year, probably next spring, to do some kind of exhibit together with a performance on my part at the Italian Cultural Institute in New York, dedicated to Giorgio Strehler's centennial. So keep your eye out for that.
Okay, and I do events at the Casa Italiana Zedili Marimo, which is the other Italian Cultural Institute, and people can see a lot of my work in the past. And I'll have you there one night doing something about Commedia. But I want to conclude by mentioning some of the music that you selected from the Adagio catalog. I'll first say that I added the recordings of Macbeth and Simone Boccanegra that I referred to earlier, with the casts with Verrett and so on, and Mirella Freni and Nikolai Gyaudov and Piero Capuccilli both, and Abbado conducting. And Strehler, you can hear in the recordings the theatrical imperative that he added to that. You mentioned Mozart's Don Giovanni, of course, the 1987 with Muti conducting. Strangely, that version is not in Adagio's catalog, but the Strehler performance with Muti conducting and some of the same cast in Vienna we did have. So that's what people will hear. So Carol Vaness, who I had last week as a guest, Cheryl Studer, who I had in March.
What year?
Pardo, 87.
Oh, okay.
87. But your cast in Milan was Thomas Allen, Claudio Desderi, Edita Gruberova as Anna, and Maria Silveira, Suzanne Menster, who was also then went to Vienna, as Zerlina, Francisco Reis, Ottavio, Natalia De Carolis, Mazzetto, and Sergei Kopchak as the commendatore. You asked for Mozart's Requiem, the Dies Irae. Why?
We were trained in choral verse speaking to act to act the text, to perform the text of the Dies Irae as if it were poetry. And so we listened to the music, but we also spoke the text in choral fashion with rhythmic. It was a very interesting project. I think it was a second year project we had at the school. I have the feeling that Strehler wanted to make some theatrical event out of it, which never occurred. But it was a wonderful, wonderful training. And of course, I don't know. I earlier said Mozart, who but Mozart could put 7 people on stage, and of course others have. But there's something to me, I find in Mozart some kind of summit that, it looms above somehow, I don't know. So to me, that music is I don't know the Verdi Requiem very well, but the Mozart one will always evoke for me. So different, right?
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I just adore that music. I adore that music. And we trained a lot with that. And we had Schubert, by the way, as the opening music every night as the lights dimmed. There was a little bit of Schubert as the kind of signature piece of our theater at the Teatro Studio in Milano. But did you want to say more about Mozart? We had also the lark arising.
Well, I'm going to get there. I want to get to Fiorenzo Carpi, the circus suite.
Yes. Well, so Fiorenzo Carpi, like Marie's Flash, Strehler worked with other composers, I'm certain, at various times. But over the course of decades, Fiorenzo Carpi, who was Roman, famously Roman, people knew him as Fio Carpi. He was, for decades, Strehler's alter ego, in that Strehler could, make a gesture and say, right here, we need something like this involving a flute. And the next day, Carpi would arrive with a melody. And Strehler, somehow they could understand one another without ever speaking a word.
The parallel is Fellini and Nino Rota worked like that for decades.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And by the way, there is a fabulous CD. I don't know where to find it now, but there's a fabulous CD of Fiorenzo Carpi's music for the Piccolo Teatro of Milano. So I didn't see much of that music on. The only music I saw was the Circus Suite. The piece from the Circus Suite that I knew already was the entrance of the bears, which is quite wonderful. But people will enjoy it a great deal.
Not to be confused with the Winter's Tale or Siegfried.
Other bears. Yeah.
My little category. And finally, I've saved it for last. Ray Vaughan Williams, The Lark Ascending for violin and orchestra. How come?
Oh my goodness. I would say listen to it and you'll know why. I mean, it's sublime.
Yes, it is. I listened to it last night, and the conclusion that I came to as to why you may have picked that was that Strehler, and this gets back to the very beginning and my teasing you a bit about mime, is that Strehler understood also in opera, not just in prose theater, that silence was as valid a theatrical element as sound.
Absolutely. And I will add one more thing too. Of course, The Lark Arising is also a little nod to my other lifelong teacher, William Shakespeare. One of the, and I think it's as good a way to, there's no way to summarize Giorgio Strehler, as you said, multifaceted. There were as many sides to Giorgio Strehler as there are to life,
Or a pineapple.
Or a pineapple, sure. Or a pineapple. I like that.
That's my
But one,
commedia dell'arte contribution.
there we go. How is,
Malazzo.
you know, Strehler and the pineapple compare and contrast? No, but what I wanted to say was one of his favorite words of all time was a German word. I had the great fortune also to work on Goethe's Faust with him, which was nothing if not quixotic in the sense that, you know, many people say, oh, Faust is unrealizable for the stage. It's too big, it's too much. It's, I don't know if it's like 18 hours of theater if you were to try to do both parts in their entirety.
Oh, that's Cats.
You naughty boy, don't you dare. Oh my God. But his favorite word was a word much beloved by Goethe, which was the verb streben. I don't speak German, but streben has a cognate in English, which is to strive after, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the lark arising, I do believe, I'm going to cry now, actually. I can feel it coming. But I do believe that the very essence of Giorgio Strehler as a human being was a kind of divine dissatisfaction. In other words, he was always striving for. So, in other words, there's no such thing as the finished work of art. There is only a work in progress. And he always felt that way, that the reason he came back again and again to Arlecchino, the reason he directed Strehler's Tempest in 1947 and again in 1977, he would return to these pieces to go deeper, to go further, to discover, to begin where he left off. And I think it's a great sort of life lesson for all of us that, thank goodness, you know, I said this to a friend the other day, but I guess this comes from Hippocrates, from the Greek medical man, Hippocrates. You know, art is long and life is short. So the great artists, they just continue trying to do better, to go a little bit further, to somehow, you know, and that was certainly who Strehler was.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the very opposite, as, I mean, maybe needs not be said, but ego, of course, is the absolute enemy of art, because as soon as we think we've done something well, that's already the beginning of our error, you know.
I've been asked on a couple of occasions to run opera companies, and in one case I accepted the job, and then the board member decided she wanted her own candidate. Never mind that. But they said to me, what would be the name of your opera company? And I said, Ego. And they said, really? What is Ego? I said, it's the Ethical Grand Opera.
I like it.
So I believe in Ego for running the arts, ethical and grand at the same time. Mace, as the Italians say, abbiamo un'intesa. We have a connected understanding that has happened in these 2 hours. I look forward to when we're back together in life and I can finally meet you in person and we can.
Oh, me too, Fred.
Host a Strehler. But in the meantime, I commend everybody to your work and to giorgiostrehler.it. And to, if you didn't really know this man, I hope that you know him better now and that you listeners will study Strehler and go to the website and find out really what an amazing person he was. Mace, thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you again.
Listen, thank you, Fred. Thank you, Fred, for creating the space within which this can happen. I'm very grateful to you.
I appreciate that. See you again.